taking the nation by storm is an entirely new asset class that has everybody confused and even has your grandmother questioning, what's an NFT? In this beginner's guide, we'll cover all of that and more. Hi, I'm Dane, designer, artist, writer, NFT creator, and more. With over 15 years experience in design and technology and a knack for making things simple, I'm here to help you today and talk about the NFT guide for beginners. Old people, young people, this is for you. If you have no clue what an NFT is, blockchain technology, stay tuned, dive in, let's go over it. So in the NFT guide for beginners, we're going to have fun exploring blockchain basics, NFT technology, how to get started, collecting, trading, creating, developing, and some helpful tips along the way. In blockchain basics, we're going to go over a 101 style primer on blockchains, smart contracts, NFTs, the different use cases, the different types, and the overall ecosystem. And the purpose of this section is for anybody that really doesn't know what blockchain is or doesn't quite understand what blockchain is or is having a hard time grasping these concepts. If you already know, go ahead and skip forward. But if you don't, this is a great little primer on kind of what to expect and maybe a better way for you to visualize what all this shit is. Uno, dos, tres, and erase. So blockchain. You've heard of it. You probably have an understanding of what it is. You've probably heard people call it a distributed ledger. I've talked about it being a big ass spreadsheet, like a huge Donald Trump style spreadsheet, the biggest spreadsheet the world has ever seen, literally, because that's what essentially it is, right? Database, whatever you want to label it, whatever you want to call it. It's a massive network of computers connected together that holds the core instructions and elements that make up this system, right? All these different nodes that connect to it are, people like you and me, miners, software applications, et cetera, they all get a copy of this little ledger. Therefore, it's immutable, it always exists, it's decentralized, everybody can do their thing, right? There's no centralized source. And what they mean by this is that instead of the data being owned by a particular company, not going to name any names, the data is owned by all of the people within the network. It's simple as that. Blockchain can be public. It is public. It also can be private, meaning, big companies, can create their own blockchain networks and use them for different things. And we'll talk about that later on. When you think about the blockchain itself, it can be hard to grasp, it can be hard to visualize. So I think, if you've never heard of, the Sierpinski triangle, that might be a great visualization to help you kind of think through this. If you are, a database engineer, a spreadsheet wizard, it might be simpler to grasp. Accountants, you could make sense of this. Financiers, you can make sense of this. Business people pounding the keyboard, sales guys, this is numbers, right? It's not complicated. When you think about the nodes within the network, the nodes are like cells within the spreadsheet or cells within a database. Those cells contain information. That information is either a mapping to another cell or to another spreadsheet, or it's literally just straight data, right? The blockchain is the same way. The block is a ledger that gets filled with rows. Those rows have columns and cells. Those columns and cells have bits of information that's either mapped to another block, etc., or is filled with data. Once that ledger or block is full, reaches its maximum capacity, a new block is created and then connected, thus alluding to the term blockchain. So if you think about it, right, if you go into Sheets, if you go into Excel, if you go into SQL, any type of structured, document like that, you max out on your rows, 1,000 rows, I don't fucking know. You got to go to a new sheet. Same thing with the blockchain. Capiche? All right, cool. Now that we understand blockchain, we have a better idea of what that is. I'm going to dive in to a little more of the nuances. I spoke about, relationships to spreadsheets, databases, cells, columns, rows, data, mapping, all that jazz. But what is it, right? Really? What's inside of those cells, for example, those rows, are these things called smart contracts. They're instruction manuals. When you think about it, at the very core, they're diagrams, they're instructions, there's rules, there's regulations. There could even be legalities tied into a smart contract, right? The simplest way to think about these things are flow diagrams or API calls. A really simple example that you'll find all over the internet is the example of the vending machine contract, but also, traffic light systems, they're also running on smart contracts, right? The traffic light is an autonomous system that has programs and computers built into it. When a car approaches it, it hits a pad. That pad recognizes the weight of the vehicle. The weight of the vehicle triggers a mechanism. That mechanism runs through a series of instructions and flows. If all the criteria is met, the traffic lights do their thing. They change, they don't change, it's, whatever. There are systems, there are control rooms where people do control these things manually through CCTV, recording and stuff like that, but they're mostly autonomous systems that are ran by little computers and sensors. That's a big example, but when you narrow it back down and you think about smart contracts and how they relate to what you're seeing in the news, artwork, real estate, finance, that's where these things came from. We'll dive more into that later. But just recognize that a smart contract is really the data inside the blockchain cell. You know what I'm saying? That smart contract has information inside of it, and what that does is it tells things how to behave, how to operate, how to go about doing whatever it is that they need to do. Inherently, they are not legal contracts, but legal contracts can be built into it. You can write things like royalties, licensing, payments, permissions, access, usage, etc. Lawyers, you get all fancy with your legalese. You link up with some sort of smart contract developer, Solidity developer, blockchain developer. You formulate a template, and then boom, you have a structured smart contract. The thing with smart contracts, though, and you really need to understand, is they have to be perfected up front. What I mean by that is once it hits that blockchain, there's no control Z. You can append information to a contract, basically by adding to it, but they're immutable. So when you hit that button to deploy, if you have a mistake in your contract that can be exploited, similar to a lot of hacks that you've seen, there's not a lot of like, oh shoot, I can just erase that mistake. You got to go in, you got to fix it, you got to deploy new contracts, etc. It's important with smart contracts to know that the upfront work and testing has to be done. There's test networks, there's ways around it, so don't get freaked out. But the purpose and the idea is to structure these sets of rules, these guidelines, these regulations, however you want to label it, so you can remove the need for people involved in repetitive tasks. That's where autonomous comes from. That's where decentralization is coming from. That's where a lot of these pushes are coming from. It's taking out the middleman, per se. And the middleman doesn't necessarily mean it's a middle man or woman. It just means it's removing the central entity in between the creator and the consumer. So jumping back into the NFT guide for beginners, we're at the core of it, NFTs. This is a big section, and I broke it down into subsections, so we'll go over them individually. But generally, NFTs are non-fungible tokens. This is what you're hearing about. This is why you're here. This is what you're curious to understand. And at the core, it's just simply an empty container that also holds an asset or data, right? We'll dive deeper into what that means, but in using the Sierpinski triangle again as a relationship or a mental model, we can see that we started at blockchain. We're now went to smart contracts, and we have gone one more level deeper into NFTs. NFTs, non-fungible tokens, are unique items that have some sort of perceived value. We'll discuss value in another section and what that means, so stay tuned. Towards the end, that's where I go into helpful hints, can identify a few things that I've been alluding to already. But before we move on to the meat and potatoes, or the faux meat and potatoes if you're not carnivorous, blockchain was the massive distributed ledger. It's like a spreadsheet. It holds bits of data and information. That bits of data and information maps or points to smart contracts. Smart contracts are rules, regulations, instructions, etc. that govern what goes on with an NFT. An NFT, what we're talking about now, is another empty container that can be filled with any type of data and information, and usually that is the asset, which you're most familiar with is artwork. And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into use cases, types of NFTs, the history, as we move through this section. So stay tuned. Let's dive in. All right, cool. So jumping back into this section, I've been talking about NFTs as an empty container, and it literally is an empty container. An example I gave to my dad was using a potato salad, that I got from the store for a barbecue, and I was like, dude, the container that holds the potato salad is the NFT, the potato salad is the data, the asset, the artwork, whatever we want to call it, right? So you think about that, you think about the Sierpinski triangle, you think about, how we've navigated this structure of information, this hierarchy of information, this mapping of information. You can see how we end up here at this other empty container because, there's a lot of different use cases for NFTs. There's a lot of different use cases for smart contracts. There's a lot of different use cases for blockchain. It's just technology. It's a new form of technology. It's a new form of technology that opens up a different type of economy and business model. It also allows for the revolution of organizations, government organizations, the collection of data, and the input mechanisms that allow the collection of data. And it gives people, the freedom and flexibility to maintain their own personal data information, opens up all sorts of personal economies, etc. So, it's hard to grasp that when you think about it because there literally are a lot of different ways. How many different ways can you use a pencil? Think about that, right? And we could probably talk about that all day long. So how many different ways do you think we could use an NFT? An NFT is an empty container that can be filled with anything. It dates back to futures trading when people were trying to come up with these complex ways to, compute mathematics and find new types of asset classes, wrapping different securities together, Then it started to spawn into real estate because real estate was an easy to understand asset class that had pretty structured general rules around it, which also then tied into artwork because Anybody that fucks around with finance and real estate is usually pretty rich, and artwork is an asset class, so naturally it started to gravitate towards that aspect, because you need to remember the people that fund the technology are the people with money. So naturally, if you're going to attract investors to a project, you want to attract people that have money. So think about that as we break it through. As the technology gets adopted, more people understand. We have builders, creators. That's how we end up with these ecosystems today, and that's why you're seeing a lot of what NFTs are. So with that being said, NFT use cases and types. We already understand what an NFT is. It's an empty container that can hold mapping information to another container, or it can hold data itself. That container sits in another container that sits in another container, Sierpinski triangle. Use it to build mental models or navigating through structures of information. And we're here at the use cases and the types. I think this is probably pretty key for people that are not really too concerned about the artwork aspect of it, or the collectible aspect of it, or the trading aspect of it. Maybe the trading if you're in finance. But if you're in business, if you're in different industry, if you're an entrepreneur, understanding the use cases and the types is probably pretty key. So NFT is a non-fungible token. We talked about that. I haven't mentioned a fungible token. A fungible token is an easily replaced item. You can think about, the US dollar. A dollar bill is a fungible token. I can give you one for another one, and it's the same value exchange. I can give you $10 of fungible tokens for one non-fungible token, because I'm saying that your non-fungible token is worth 10 fungible tokens. You get it. And then we have a little fancy free-for-all called the semi-fungible token, which is a combination of non-fungible tokens and fungible tokens that have a specific utility built into it, which relates heavily to utility NFTs, which is another type of NFT. So the semi-fungible token, you can think about something like a concert ticket. That concert ticket is general admission. General admission is interchangeable for any other general admission type ticket. However, at the end of the show, let's say the artwork that some fancy pants artist drew was attached to the event ticket. That now can become a non-fungible token, because people trade and collect tickets. The majority of tickets will be destroyed, thus leaving that particular one as a rare and unique item with sentimental value, which opens up primary and secondary markets. And that's why you have things like trading and stuff like that. So those are some high-level examples of what NFTs, FTs, SFT, UNFTs are. Utility NFTs are referring to more things like identity management, domain names, stuff like that. But when you think about how this is being used, we're not really talking about the enterprise aspect enough. Enterprise corporations are using this already. They have found ways to develop private blockchains and contain their data, and do all sorts of cool stuff. There's interesting healthcare marketplaces. There's intellectual property marketplaces. Real estate agents and brokers are selling, all sorts of different assets, especially here in Miami. Come on, step it up, New York. What the hell? It's where I was born. They're doing all sorts of shit, right? E-commerce, we know already that baloney. You see what's happening with the artwork. Insurance, there's actual insurance companies that are offering up financial security for traders, because there's a massive, what do we call it, industry called decentralized finance, or DeFi for short, where financiers have gotten in on the game and figured out ways how to, trade NFTs, trade altcoins, fractionalize NFTs, fractionalize altcoins, stake currencies, loan out those currencies like, options and shit like that. And also Right, insurance. You gotta love it. But the thing is, it doesn't matter. Different companies are using NFTs for events, concerts, so on and so forth. Supply chains are using it to track items that cross multiple jurisdictions. I could see NFTs being used way beyond this. So you look at what we know that NFTs are being used for real estate, NFTs are being used for finance, NFTs are being used for NFT artwork and media. They're now being used publicly for domain names and stuff like that, collectibles, gaming, insurance, and we can start to think and wrap our minds around what's going on here. In jumping back into this, talking about NFTs and kind of the core technology and the basics around it, it wouldn't be complete if I didn't touch on the blockchain ecosystem so you can kind of understand how this is all fallen into place. There's generally 3 different layers: layer 0, layer 1, and layer 2. And those layers serve different purposes. If you've seen other videos that I put here on the YouTube, I've talked about bridges and interoperability and their relationship to layer 0 and how that sits between the networks and allows for the passing of information. Layer 1 is the core, the foundation. It's the main networks. It's blockchain, it's Ethereum, it's, things like that. They are built a certain way. They will always be built that way, which is why you have, blockchain Cash, Ethereum, things like Ethereum 2.0. So the whole, makeup, the whole design was that they would do a certain thing and that's all they would ever do. And that's where we kind of get into this situation with layer 2, because layer 2 comes into play to improve the efficiency of these infrastructures, right? When we think about this in normal business today, we have a lot of core industries that do a lot of different things. At those core industries are core companies. Those core companies are foundations, are bedrocks, are large, over-encompassing companies that are pretty much set in their ways, and they're not going to be much more than that, right? And then you have these smaller companies that come in and specialize and offer particular services to make the larger companies' lives easier, for example, right? And that's a way that we can think of layer 1 and layer 2 being connected by layer 0. Because in some way, shape, or form, data needs to be passed from layer 1 through layer 0 to layer 2. In any of these blockchains, in any of these regular business models, inputs and outputs are generally the core, right? So the blockchain ecosystem is like a lasagna. It's made up of different layers, and within those different layers, there's also subsequent layers and other offerings that help make, these core elements function better. So, just like what we've discussed, we're just navigating through these structures, these different levels of information. We're passing information through this distributed network that's existing parallel to our current universes in a digital world. So it's difficult to understand, it's difficult to grasp, because there's a lot of different mental models that have to be built around this, right? All right, my pixelated party people, if you're still tagging along for this little soiree, thank you. I appreciate it. I'm working pretty hard to try to make this as valuable as possible. If you're popping in on this, there's a whole series of shit that I'm talking about the NFT guide for beginners. So feel free to check the playlist out or whatever. But truthfully, a lot of people are jumping into NFTs or curious about NFTs because of everything they're hearing on the news and in media outlets about buying, collecting, trading, bippity bop, right? Billions of dollars, millions of dollars, trillions of dollars, gazillions of dollars. The industry is huge. Donald Trump, huge. You know what I'm saying? So let's talk about that. You want to buy NFTs? You want to collect NFTs? You want to trade NFTs? Good for you. You want to get started with that? How do you do it? Easy peasy lemon squeezy. First thing you got to do, obviously, is have a wallet. Wallet is like MetaMask, Phantom. There's a trillion other of them, you know. All a wallet is like an authentication device, right? But it holds your digital assets, you know. So, in going back to this container analogy, a wallet is literally an empty container that has identification information associated with it, and that identification information allows you access to different applications in the Web3 ecosystem, right? Which is why when you do get your wallet and you have to go through the process of quote unquote signing things and paying gas fees or transaction fees, you know, that is, you know, the general makeup of the scenario. So once you have your wallet, depending on what networks you want to buy NFTs on, what networks you want to collect NFTs on, that's going to be dependent on the wallet. Like I said, I mentioned MetaMask and I mentioned Phantom. Those are the two most popular ones that I know of. I mean, there's more. Brave browser has one built in, you know, whatever. There's a list of them. There's a trillion different lists of them. The basic functionality is that it's an empty container that holds assets and identification information for a particular network, depending on, you know, what's going on. So we understand that, right? In order to get these assets, we got to have exchange accounts because we need to exchange our fiat currencies for cryptocurrencies, right? If you want to start buying NFTs, you need to have an exchange account on something like Coinbase, FTX, Binance, Kraken, blah, blah, blah. You need to purchase Ethereum. Ethereum is the gateway drug to this NFT crack den. Depending on how deep down the rabbit hole you go, that Ethereum needs to be exchanged on the exchange network for particular asset classes like Polygon, Solana, what else? Cardano, you know, Shiba. Come on, Shiba, to the moon, please. I'm trying to retire early. You see what I'm saying here? So in order to play, you got to pay. You got to pay by buying Ethereum. Then you got to pay, if you want to, by exchanging that Ethereum for an altcoin. You can stay in Ethereum. However, when you are buying, collecting, and trading, straight Ethereum has high gas fees, which is something you'll hear about all the time. People complaining about gas. It's not because they've had too much fiber. It's simply because the network is congested and it's costing a shitload of money to rectify transactions. Easy peasy. So now that you're buying these things, you're collecting these things, you're on OpenSea, you're on SoulSea, you're on all these different marketplaces like Foundation and Rarible, you're using different tools like Nifty Sniper or Rarity Tools, and you're understanding the ecosystem. You want to start trading, right? Easy peasy. You could just buy it low and sell it high, right? That's how it works. I don't think so, buddy. The real trick to trading, if you have time for it, is getting on whitelists. In order to get on whitelists, you got to run through the dark depths of Discord. You're going to be in hundreds and hundreds of Discord channels. You're going to be all over the circle jerks of Twitter. You're going to be networking. You're going to be making friends. And you're going to be trying to figure out who has the loudest voice and who's moving the next market forward. That's why you want to get on these lists, because if you're on these lists, you have access to the initial minting of these coins, these tokens, and you set the primary market. The idea is that in order to make these 10, 15, 20 trillion X returns, you have to sit at the bottom of the barrel, set the primary market, and capitalize on the gains. You can make a flip on the secondary market. It's happening like crazy, but the real deal, Evander Holyfield, happens there. So buying, collecting, and trading, a couple different things, all interlinked, interrelated. You get the wallet, you fill the wallet with a currency, you exchange the currency if necessary, you make friends, you find out the influencers, you find out the market movers, you figure out what's hot and what's not, you get on the lists and get invited to the parties, and when you show up, you put your cash up and you play. Simple. All right, great. So we're jumping back into this little ditty about the NFT guide for beginners. We're going to talk about creating. If you're just jumping into this, there's a bunch of other videos in the playlist and a full video that I've compiled for the purists that just want it all at once. Otherwise, you can take it bit by bit. I've explained blockchain basics. I've explained NFT, smart contracts, the general gist of buying, collecting, trading, wallets, exchanges, etc. And now, if you're curious, I'll have a sip of coffee and wet my whistle, and we'll talk about creating. So looky here. Creating an NFT is actually super simple. It's way easier than you think, especially when you're talking about just specifically artwork. If you're going to go beyond the simple use cases of art, it gets a little more complicated, and we'll touch on that. But at the core of the art and collectibles aspect of things, if you are an artist, a designer, something like that, and you're curious how this could work, or if you're just generally curious how you could use NFT artwork and collectibles for your business as a promotional, item or a revenue stream, then the simple aspect is that there's, any form of art can be used. I know a guy who paints by hand, digitizes those paintings, sells them. I have a friend who is an illustrator, illustrates by hand, digitizes the illustration, colors in Photoshop. I myself mostly work in vector and pixel-based programs, do some hand-drawn artwork. I have other friends that do 3D modeling, rendering, and create NFT artwork as well. So really, it doesn't matter the point, right? It can be any form of artwork. There's actual NFT collections that are just text, believe it or not. To create them, it's just as simple as creating an asset. If you wanted to, you could literally create a cartoon in Microsoft Paint, save it as a JPEG, and you have the core element, because creating an NFT is all geared around the input types that are accepted. Image files, video files, audio files, these are common file formats that creatives are going to be familiar with and are going to be outputting. Those assets, those artworks, get attached to the smart contract, which we discussed earlier. And the smart contract is the rules and regulations, the licensing, the royalties, the payments, all the information that's related to the ownership, the provenance, and the rights to the artwork, right? Or the asset attached. Because if we extrapolate the concept and we go back to what we were talking about earlier, an NFT doesn't necessarily have to be art. It can be real estate, it can be intellectual property, it can be a supply and a supply chain, etc. The smart contract is what governs the asset. It's what talks about the ruling. It's all encapsulated in the NFT, right? To create NFTs, like I said, you can use a variety of different programs, different input-output methods. Photoshop, Procreate, Adobe Illustrator, Figma, Affinity, Adobe Premiere, Adobe, Acrobat, maybe, Microsoft Paint, Blender, what have you. You can use HTML, you can use CSS, you can use Python, you can use R, you can use JavaScript, you can use processing, you can use all different types of programming language. There's many different ways to create the appropriate file format. Developing the smart contract is a little bit harder, but it depends on what your intention is. if you're looking to create a collection of items, and those collections of items are, variations or generative formats, having a smart contract to deploy is key. If you're just doing one-of-one digital artworks, you can mint easily from marketplaces, but there are limitations to that. So it just depends. Honestly, you could write a smart contract for one-of-one if you want to. There's tons of different tutorials on how to do that, but we'll talk about that more in the next section on developing. And in all of that, really, just know that creating is super easy, right? And producing is super easy. The hardest aspect in any business is sales and marketing, which is why entire arms of corporations and companies are devoted to sales and marketing. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a ton of consistency. So you just have to be prepared to show up. The creation part isn't a problem, but if nobody wants it, nobody's going to buy it. And nobody knows if they want it or not if they don't know about it. So the last bit of this is going to be about developing NFTs from the NFT Guide for Beginners. And it's just going to really cover at a high level the programming languages that are involved, the kind of things you might need to know, the kind of things you might come across, and what it takes to build out NFT smart contracts, minting applications, and stuff like that. So when you get down to it, C is the basic programming language. It is what the internet is built off of. It is pretty much what most programs for software kind of rely on, but it's object-oriented programming is what you really need to keep in mind, right? When you think about blockchain, when you think about the development, Solidity and Rust are the languages that smart contracts are being written in, and how the core technologies are being developed. And for the most part, they're built heavily off of the principles of like C. So if you're an old school developer and you know these languages, there's a market for you, and there's a high demand. And then when you really kind of round it around and you get to the front end of things, traditional front end developers, JavaScript, HTML, CSS, that's key because, it's not that this technology is new, it's evolving. So there's old technologies that we can build off of, and that we're using to kind of start getting into this. So when you think about like writing a contract, right? Writing a smart contract for an NFT is not a very challenging thing. There's a ton of tutorials on the internet. You can piece them together. There's already a bunch of different standards in place for the most part. It'd be fantastic if there was a no-code solution to make it easy to build collections and stuff. But in general, if you know your way around the computer, for the most part, you can kind of figure it out because you just import different dependencies and make edits to those dependencies in regards to your NFT or your NFT collection. If you want to become more complex, that's when you really need to know these languages and how to work with them in order to build in the different functions and functionalities. From there, one of the types of smart contracts, and something you've probably seen before, is a minting application. You go to a website, you get on that whitelist, you're able to jump into the markets before the primaries hit, and you get a bunch of NFTs at a steal, right? Well, those are minting applications, and that's basically a smart contract tied to a call to action, which triggers a mechanism and releases the NFT. And that's done through things like Solidity, Rust, JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. So it's really important that people know this because as this is evolving, we definitely want to be as semantic as possible too. So all you Web3ers, HTML semantics and transcending CSS, those are probably key things to know. But what I'm getting at is, to develop these things, to write these things, there's a high barrier to entry, but there's a lot of resources available. Blech. And I say high barrier to entry because it's just technical knowledge. You need to know stuff, but that's truthfully it. That's the core. Solidity is what these Ethereum contracts are being written in. If you want to dive into making your own smart contracts for NFTs, You can work with Solidity contracts, and you can import the different dependencies. You can use IDEs like Remix. You can pull stuff down to your local machine. If you're feeling saucy and you want to go beyond that and you have development skill sets, you can start building decentralized applications. In order to do so, back-end programming and front-end programming is going to be necessary, and things like C, JavaScript, HTML, and CSS are crucial. So if you enjoy this content, thank you, I appreciate it. Be sure to like, subscribe, and follow, and we'll jump into the final little bits. Cool. So thank you for tagging along with all this content. I really do appreciate it. We covered a lot of information, blockchain basics, smart contracts, NFTs, use cases, different types, how to create, collect, buy, trade, develop, the whole 9 yards, the ecosystems, etc. I hope you found the content to be useful. If you do, please like, subscribe, follow. And then just as some further helpful tips, this is for everybody, creators, traders, whoever's getting involved in NFTs. Have an understanding of Business 101. It's probably pretty important in the sense of you'll get an idea of what's going on. You'll get an idea of the minds that are in it. You'll get an idea of how people are kind of running through, the forest and making their fields. Have an idea of marketing. And I don't talk about marketing in the sense of like, here's my CTA, here's my sales funnel. I'm talking about marketing in the aspect of actual market making. How markets are created, how markets are driven, how the science and the art that goes into establishing a brand, establishing a message, establishing a tone, establishing an image, and all of the different nuances that go into this game, because when you really understand that, you start to understand what's happening in the early stages, and you can position yourself for success, whether you are a creator, whether you are a trader, or whether you are somebody that's working in between to help link all these different things together. You know what I mean? And really, to round that out, Finance 101. There's tons and tons of videos on YouTube. There's some basic understandings of the history of finance and how we assign and associate value. Those are key, I think, in understanding what's going on with cryptocurrencies and the world of money in general. If you're in the United States, you can look at things like the origins of the Federal Reserve. You can look at how our fiat currency system is structured. I can't speak for all the other currencies and countries in the world, but I'm sure that you have similar histories. You can look at the history of finance in the sense of how, different tribes used to use glass marbles and how that was exploited because that particular resource was readily available in other portions of the world. You can look at how the tulip became a highly prized object because of a genetic defect that occurred during the importation of the tulip to Holland. You can see how financial markets were actually established way back during the times of the East India Trading Company, and how stocks were created and how the markets were made around those stocks because particular people were not allowed to own specific assets, so stocks became a glamorous thing to control. So there's tons of resources. Do your own research is a big acronym in crypto world. D.Y.O.R, D.O.R, blah blah blah. But it's important to have this general understanding. So Business 101, knowing how business operates, how their mindsets are functioning, and what's going into that. Marketing 101, like market making and actual establishments of marketing. The 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing is a great book on this. And Finance 101, value, how we assign value, and the history of currencies. Once again, thanks for tagging along, and if you enjoy this content, please like, subscribe, and share.